A good morning from IISS in Washington, D.C., and a warm welcome to today's webinar on conflict in Sudan, roots of the war, regional implications, and the way forward. My name is Benjamin Petrini. I'm a research fellow here at IISS in the Conflict Security and Development program, a program that monitors armed conflicts and domestic instability at the global level. We conduct research on some of the most relevant trends in conflict, including peacekeeping and stabilization, interventions, non-state armed groups, and the internationalization of civil wars. Our team produces the IISS yearly flagship publication, Armed Conflict Survey, which is a compendium of all armed conflicts globally and with the recent developments and happenings. Today's session is part of the Conflict Briefings webinar series, where we take a different conflict every 2 months and we invite expert speakers to sort of elucidate on the main conflict dynamics. Today's is on Sudan. We will talk about the armed conflict that broke out on April 15 between the two factions of the military, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, and how this dynamics has completely overshadowed the civilian power transition that had started in 2019. In many ways, this conflict is unprecedented, as never during its troubled history that has the violence escalated to this level in the center of the country, in the capital of Khartoum. In particular, we will discuss 4 main issues. First, some of the historical dimensions. Since independence in 1956, Sudan has experienced a very little peace and over 55 years of military rule. And we will look and discuss how the structural center-periphery divide within the country is replicated within this current conflict. Second, we will focus a bit on where we are on the conflict and get some clarity on the developments on the ground. The latest 7-day ceasefire has just been brokered by the US and Saudi Arabia and started on Monday, but there are reports that this has already been violated. There are no signs of slowing down for the conflict, despite the several ceasefires that have been declared. Third, we will talk about more the overarching significance of the conflict, the risks for escalation and for the conflict having a turn with an ethnic dimension and becoming a more identity-based conflict, which is obviously a dimension that is very present in Sudanese society. We will talk about the regional implications and the fact that Sudan borders 7 different countries and how the conflict is having impacts at the regional level, the ties with Gulf countries, and the more international dimension. And finally, we'll try to elucidate on the way forward, on options or possibilities for conflict resolution, or what the conflict trajectory might take. Now, I have the pleasure of welcoming our 3 esteemed speakers, and I will introduce them in order of appearance. Dan Watson is a senior researcher at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, better known as ACLED. He's a Sudan expert and specializes in conflict and peace processes in the Horn of Africa, particularly in Sudan and South Sudan. He is also a contributor to our armed conflict survey. Welcome, Dan. Second, Anette Hoffmann. She's a senior research fellow at the Conflict Research Unit of Klingendael in the Netherlands. Her work focuses on the interaction between economic and political drivers of conflict. And she spent over 10 years working in Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia for the UN and the German Agency for International Cooperation, or GIZ, among others, as an advisor on conflict sensitivity. And last but welcome, Annette. And last but not least, Jok Madut Jok is a professor of anthropology at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. His areas of specialization include security, governance, democracy, and development in South Sudan and Sudan. He's the author of Breaking Sudan, The Search for Peace from 2017, and the seminal work, War and Slavery in Sudan from 2001, that any Sudanese scholar or expert would know this work. Between 2010 and 2013, Dr. Jok served in the government of South Sudan as Undersecretary in the Ministry of Culture and Heritage. Welcome, Jok.
Thank you.
Now, before we start, just some quick logistics and housekeeping. I will moderate this webinar. We will have a first round of remarks by the speakers, followed by some reactions and questions, and then we will open it to you ask your question by typing in the Q&A box at any time during the webinar, so you don't have to wait for the end, and then I will relate the question for you. Now, let's get on to it with Dan Watson. So as a first question, or for sort of first introduction, Dan, can you tell us where we are on the conflict and going a bit beyond the media reports, and what are the recent developments? What is happening on the ground in the battlefield, as well as on the negotiating table? Just a very quick summary on where we are. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. So before I sort of give an overview of the sort of trajectory of conflict and the ceasefires, I'd like to sort of highlight two trends that I think need to be noted first in order to contextualize what's going on. So firstly, the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF, they've reflected different aspects of a system that has become both more militarized and more unstable in recent years. Militias and armed groups who once occupied a peripheral role in security systems under former President Bashir have increasingly taken a more central role in Sudanese political, security and economic affairs since the removal of Bashir in 2019. And this has resulted in collusion, but also competition between these forces. And critically, it's enabled armed groups from remote provinces to gain a foothold in urban centers, particularly in the capital city of Khartoum. Secondly, violence in Sudan has become increasingly urbanized after 2019, with civil unrest, fighting and massacres, which sometimes overlap with one another, being concentrated in Sudan's provincial towns and cities, particularly in Darfur, but to a lesser extent in southern and eastern areas of the country. Often these conflicts in urban areas were the result of a combination of political competition and uncertainty that was induced by the Juba Peace Agreement that was signed in 2020, which saw several ex-rebel groups ultimately aligned with the military bloc in advance of the coup in 2021. And at times they are the result of manipulation of ethnically organized political factions and militias by major players in the security sector. Now, these two trends have resulted in a kind of spatial compression and entangling of this center-periphery divide Ben mentioned earlier, which has been a long-running feature of the geography of violence in Sudan. But they have also set up and shaped the geography and trajectory of the current fighting. So the traditional sequence of conflict in Sudan has been for conflict to move from the peripheries towards garrison towns, and that's not really in effect here. Instead, we're seeing violence radiating outwards from urban centers, but also clustering around infrastructure that is vital for military logistics. Now, the fighting is playing out largely in two theaters, that is in Greater Khartoum, as well as the Darfur region in Western Sudan, and the transport corridor between them. Serious clashes have occurred in much of the free cities that comprise Greater Khartoum, though artillery strikes and airstrikes from the army have been the primary way in which the Sudan Armed Forces has engaged the RSF in recent weeks. The RSF has forcibly entered civilian residences as well as the industrial districts of Khartoum North to help mitigate the air superiority of the regular army, with the RSF in particular being accused of violence against civilians, including sexual violence. The regular army has also operated alongside the Central Reserve Police, which is another Bashir-era paramilitary force, and they've engaged the RSF in parts of the capital. The second theatre is in Darfur, particularly in and around urban areas, where there has also been widespread looting and displacement, as in Khartoum. Some of the most serious violence has taken place in Jenaina, close to the Chadian border, and here fighting has drawn in ethnically organised militias, continuing a trend that's been ongoing in the city since late 2019, where different security forces align themselves with militias. There has been sporadic fighting in other parts of Darfur, including in the major city of Nyala in South Darfur, as well as other state capitals and the town of Kebkebir. Serious fighting has also been reported in Al Abayad in North Kordofan state, on the road between Darfur and Khartoum. There is ongoing militia fighting in parts of Greater Darfur and Kordofan, and to a lesser extent in Blue Nile state in the southeast. Though whether and to what extent this is related to the overarching conflict between the SAF and the RSF is not that clear. That being said, there is a high risk that subnational militia violence will become subsumed into the wider conflict over time, which could result in multiple overlapping conflicts operating at different levels. The use of militias would help the belligerents offset the inevitable depletion of munitions, fuel, and soldiers that they will experience as the war continues, and transfer risk onto relatively expendable militias. Now, before discussing the ceasefire talks, it should be noted that large tracts of Darfur and other unstable areas, such as South Kordofan and Blue Nile, have not, for the time being at least, experienced serious conflict as of yet. This is due to a number of ethno-political constituencies and rebel groups purposefully staying out of the conflict. This abstention from the war is not guaranteed to endure, and the potential for such factions to become involved in violence in specific areas of the country will become higher as the conflict continues. I should note here that the recent appointment of the ex-rebel leader Malik Agar as a de facto vice president by President Burhan is a concerning. General Burhan is a concerning indication that rebel groups who signed the Juba peace agreement might be drawn further into the sphere of either the Sudan Armed Forces or RSF, though Agar is in a distinct position compared to most of the major rebel leaders, being particularly dependent on the military to help rebuild his power base in his home area of Blue Nile. So finally, there have been a number of ceasefire agreements brokered with Saudi and American facilitation in Jeddah. These are indirect talks, which are limited to a small number of representatives only from the belligerent parties, so not from civil society, not from political parties or Sudan's resistance committees. And these primarily pertain to issues of humanitarian access and ceasefire modalities. The ceasefire agreements that have emerged from these talks have repeatedly been broken, though have resulted in brief, albeit inconsistent pauses in the fighting. The talks in Jeddah will not necessarily morph into a fully fledged peace process, and such a peace process, if it did emerge, would likely involve regional or sub-regional blocs, notably IGAD. There are indications that the latest week-long ceasefire that came into effect this Monday evening have temporarily reduced violence, though, as Ben alluded to earlier, have already been broken in parts of Khartoum and El Abayad, and likely in several parts of Darfur, including Zalanji. Meanwhile, some aid has arrived in Port Sudan, though I understand it has not yet been distributed. Now, I'll conclude by saying that any permanent solution to the conflict would require a serious effort to demilitarize Sudan's political and economic systems that form a kind of infrastructure around which violent competition takes place. It would also need to recognize that the relationship between this enlarged security and paramilitary sector and the economic systems they feed off is inherently unstable and arguably unsustainable. It should also avoid some of the errors of recent peacemaking initiatives in which elements of the civilian political spectrum are represented, typically only politically conservative factions, whilst engagement with the broader political spectrum, including locally organised resistance committees, these such groups are not represented in the talks. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. This was a great introduction. I'll take away from your points how the conflict has some novelty in the fact that the state is becoming more militarized, and as well as the economy. The violence is becoming more urban since 2019. You gave us a bit of a snapshot of the hotspots of the violence. and also highlighted some of the escalation risks because of the armed groups are progressively being drawn into the conflict, and how the ceasefires are very limited in scope. Let me turn to you, Anette, now, and if we can take a step back into thinking and looking at how the conflict has a relationship with the political transition that has started since the removal of al-Bashir in 2019. And so how can we make sense of the last 3 or 4 years of the transition and the conflict in Sudan? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I'd like to start by expressing my solidarity with the Sudanese who are suffering the consequences of this ruthless, senseless war. I would like to talk about Sudan's transition since 2019 and up to the outbreak of the war as a tale of 2 stories. One story is the story of Sudan's failed civilian-led transition, and the other story is one of a peaceful revolution against ongoing militarization and legacies of impunity. I start with the first story. This period of transition was ushered in by a popular uprising that started in late 2018, and it brought together really people from all walks of life. It spread across all regions and stick to methods of peaceful resistance, lasted for months, and eventually managed to oust longtime dictator Bashir in April 2019. This is the moment when the generals of the 2 factions that we see fighting each other today, Sudanese Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces, their heads took over power. Both, as Dan referred to earlier, had actually benefited from Bashir's regime, had grown into, the generals they are today, thanks to Bashir's regime. But they understood very quickly that they could only survive the fall of Bashir if they would side with the revolution and take over power. So they entered a power-sharing agreement then with the civilian leaders, headed by Prime Minister Hamdok, and that was celebrated by the international community as a step towards a transition towards democracy. So Sudan was welcomed back into the international community, also back into the international financial system, which was a significant move for the country. A number of really difficult political, economic, and judicial reforms kicked off. And there was the Juba Peace Agreement that was signed in 2020, as referred to earlier. These were celebrated as milestones in Sudan's transition. However, when the reform started to pay off in autumn 21, the 2 generals decided to snatch power from the civilians and prevent the handover of the chair of the Sovereignty Council to a civilian leader. This is when the transition really came to a halt. In response, international supporters and friends of Sudan put their aid on hold. The debt relief package of around $50 billion was frozen. So it was made very clear to the generals that in order to return to a civilian-led transition, in order for aid to resume, they had to return to civilian-led transition. It took a year for the generals to realize that they were unable to run the country, unable to mobilize domestic popular support, and to convince the international community to reactivate international aid. So in 22, a political dialogue was initiated, facilitated by a tripartite mechanism of UNITAMS, IGAD, and the AU, the Quad, and others. And eventually that led to the signing of an initial framework agreement in December. Pertes, the head of UNITAMS, the UN mission to Sudan, at the time reassured last March, actually, the Security Council that Sudan was very close to resuming that civilian-led transition. In reality, tensions between the 2 generals had been on the rise for many months already. There'd been recruitment of new troops, movements of equipment, and an increasingly aggressive rhetoric. It is then talks around integration of the RSF into SAF that maybe functioned as a trigger for these two generals to take up arms. This is the story of a derailed, failed, and almost restored transition leading up to the war. However, it's a story that is very detached from the struggles of most of Sudan's 46 million citizens. And yet the story has survived the war so far. And therefore, I think it's important to also stress what this other story is. That is a story of a revolution against the ongoing militarization that we see now in full swing. This story has been repeatedly told by many Sudanese. Although it was them who toppled longtime military dictator Bashir, the transition that ensued was largely managed by the military. And we've seen in that transition that their power actually increased throughout. And I'd like to highlight that by 3 points in that historical phase of 3 to 4 years. One is 3rd of June. The 3rd of June 2019, protesters had gathered for almost 2 months in front of the military headquarters to ensure that the transitional military council that followed Bashir's fall would not lead the country, but hand over power to a civilian-led government. And that protest movement was violently dispersed by the military leaders. It resulted in a massacre of over 100 unarmed civilians killed, and justice has never been served to that massacre. I think this massacre was a sneak preview of the military junta's readiness to unleash the same type of violence they used during the conflict in Darfur on their citizens in the capital that we see since the 15th of April. It's also been really a clear sign of encroachment on civic space that the protesters had struggled so hard to gain after Bashir's fall. And finally, I think important to highlight that the perpetrators of these crimes have never been held accountable, and the committee that had been set up to investigate and interviewed many victims had been dissolved by the generals in 21. The second example is the Juba peace agreement that was mentioned before, and I think as Dan rightly pointed out, although that was celebrated as a success in terms of bringing on board more of the armed groups from the peripheries, in reality, what we saw is that the transitional justice element in the Juba peace agreement was not really spelled out in terms of clear timelines and actions. And the agreement before and after the agreement, we saw an increase in violence in Darfur. And more importantly, maybe, or as important, is that with this agreement, the balance of power really tilted towards the military because the leaders of the armed movements had to be integrated into the transitional government and obtained important positions in power. So here again, instead of going into a transition towards more civilian rule and democracy, we were actually moving backwards and grant more power to the military. And then lastly, of course, the military coup, when SAF and the rapid support forces snatched power from the civilians and upended the transition. However, even though this was an unconstitutional legal action, they were both leaders, welcomed back into negotiations and asked to please re-engage with the civilians into what could then be a return into to civilian-led transition. So overall, this story clearly shows, and civilians have been highlighting it, that they've been failed by their military leaders, and that every repeated efforts to engage the military leaders into a political solution have actually not just derailed or delayed the transition, but reversed the transition and undermined the revolution that people had fought against the militarization and legacy of impunity. And so the 3 lessons I'd like to take away, and I'll be really quick with that, is that I think when and how this war can be ended really depends on how we read the tale of these 2 stories. Because we know pretty well what hasn't worked, which is that putting the generals more at the heart of the transition will only advance their power and undermine the strive for civilian rule. And that applies to the current negotiations, whether they are just about a temporary ceasefire or then leading into peace negotiations. Also, we've seen that too many mediators and facilitators that stubbornly stick to a certain narrative, calling for return to transition. And even now we hear this, the war needs to end to return to a civilian-led transition. I think is really misleading because that transition has ended several times. And then third and lastly, yes, civilian opposition must take center stage in any further negotiations. Again, whether it is about temporary ceasefires, about humanitarian corridors, they're at the forefront of delivering humanitarian aid. They're the ones that have been fighting for the less militarization and civilian rule. So it is high time to ensure that they are part of those discussions and not just the subjects of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. First of all, for those words of solidarity that I think we can all join on those. Very important. I very like your sort of dual narrative on giving us sort of a trajectory of the failed transition in the last 3-4 years, but also putting very much the talking really about the role of the military since then and how their deliberate effort not to derail but just to keep power. I'm not doing justice to your words, but I think it came out very clear. Let me turn to you, Jok. Can we do a further sort of step back and look at how the current conflict sort of has ties with the several civil wars that took place in the country since independence, and that obviously led then to the independence of South Sudan in 2011. So can we tie this conflict to the larger conflict dynamics in the country? Over to you. Thank you.
Most certainly. Thank you. And I will say about 4 quick points to answer or to respond to what you have just laid out. The first thing is that these horrible images that are coming out of Sudan are shocking, not just because of the suffering or the destruction of infrastructure that is happening there, but primarily because this is happening in Khartoum, inside the seat of the government. Khartoum has always been the exporter of violence. Khartoum has always responded nonchalantly. I mean, by Khartoum, I'm referring to the elite, whether they are in the political parties or they are in the army. They have always been lukewarm about this type of violence when it happened in southern Sudan, as it was called, when it happened in Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains, in southern Blue Nile. There has never been a strong expression of objection to that war by Khartoum's elite. So the fact that those ghastly wars that used to take place in the peripheries have now shifted to Khartoum is what makes this war very, very shocking indeed. That's one. Second is that the war in Khartoum right now, the war in Sudan right now has been long in the making. It did not just it did not just explode. Successive governments of Sudan, dating back to Ibrahim Aboud in 1958, through to Sadiq al-Mahdi, through to al-Bashir, and currently to al-Burhan, all these governments have had a tradition that classified the people of Sudan by race, by religion, by social class, by center-periphery relationships, etc. And it was that story of classification of people that has dominated how the wars in the peripheries were fought. Those who were classed as in-group were often preferred. Those who are identified as the troublemakers, Turabi referred to as the Black Belt were often seen as the object of the state's oppression. So the fact that now this war is being fought in Khartoum by people who came from those peripheries that used to be excluded has given a lot of people, especially from South Sudan, a sense that maybe this is the first time the Sudanese in the center are going to taste the bitterness of war. Horrible as it is now the first time that they will see when the war comes into their own homes, where their kids are no longer in school, where aerial bombardment by the very military of the country is happening. The Sudanese, who have always outsourced violence and exported it to the peripheries, are for the first time able to see what the war is like. The third thing I want to say is that because of the classification of people, which then is accompanied by unfair distribution of the national pie, if you wish, whether it is development services, whether it is jobs, because of this classification, there are people who have always been excluded from the services of the state. And because of this exclusion, they protested. Southern Sudan protested until it became independent. On the heels of the peace agreement between North and South, the Darfur people started their war. Before the peace agreement, during the war in South Sudan, you had Blue Nile, you had some people from Darfur, you had Nuba Mountains joining South Sudan in John Garang's idea of unity of the peripheries against the center. And when these peripheries went into protest, the classic response from Khartoum was counterinsurgency. And that counterinsurgency created a mess of disruption of social order in the peripheries by recruiting militias from within these groups to fight against their own people. And these classified people into Arab tribes versus non-Arab tribes. And the counterinsurgency that was practiced in Southern Sudan and later on in Darfur and later on in South Kordofan, in Nuba Mountains particularly, was so aggressive and so destructive that in comparison to other episodes of suppression of revolt, it doesn't compare to anything other than perhaps the French suppression of Algerian revolt. And because of this counterinsurgency that targets people in general, without any discriminating who is a combatant and who is not, has angered the people in the periphery, such that when the Darfur situation exploded, the Sudanese government, particularly al-Bashir, has banked on that history of using militias as a counterinsurgency tool. And it built on something that used to be called popular defense forces, which were usually Darfuris or people from the traditional north being recruited and sent into Southern Sudan. They became known as in Southern Sudan as Murahilin, which means they were on horseback. And these Murahilin became the popular defense forces fighting in the south. It was these popular defense forces that then morphed into what became known as Janjaweed within Darfur. And it was Janjaweed then that morphed into the Rapid Support Force under General Mohammed Hamdan Daglo. And that Daglo was was made by al-Bashir. They call him Hameti, which is a childhood nickname meaning Little Muhammad. He's called Hameti, but al-Bashir eventually corrupted the name and referred to him as Himayati. Himayati in Arabic means my defense or my protector. That's how important Hamdan Daglo became for the defense of Khartoum. So they made him. But then when this war broke out, because of the efforts of the Juba Peace Agreement and other processes going on in order to merge the two forces, Daglo did not like the terms of his merger with the Sudan Armed Forces. The fact that currently Al-Burhan refers to Daglo, to Hameti, as a thug, as a militia leader, as a criminal, is almost like Putin referring to the Wagner group as a militia, as a criminal militia, as opposed to what? So my point is that this current war is building on all these political and processes and on all these wars that have taken place and all these designs of counterinsurgency that built on using tribal militias to fight side by side with the regular armed forces. So Rapid Support Force, which is now become a menace, was made by the very army that now it is fighting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jok, for this overview spanning several decades. And I would say that the thread among all your remarks is really this center periphery divide. I highlight the identity element and the categorization of people as a structural driver of violence in Sudan. And also the point that you referred to about the exclusion and a report that I worked on before my time here at the Institute, Pathways for Peace, a UN World Bank report, really highlighted how exclusion of people and of groups is really at the heart of conflict. So this is definitely a confirmation of that. Now that we have sort of set the stage with the historical drivers and sort of where the conflict comes from, I think we can turn into talking and thinking about what is the way forward, or what could be some solutions, or what are some of the other like wider implications. So let me return to you, Dan, about if you can give us like a quick overview of what are some of the regional aspects in Eastern Africa and the Horn and the extended neighborhood for Sudan. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Well, I think we've got, there's a number of countries which are very vulnerable to destabilization from Sudan, particularly Chad, and South Sudan, and they're remaining publicly neutral. South Sudan is taking a mediator role via IGAD, although it's not necessarily clear whether what kind of process exactly they are mediating. And this is kind of a continuation of what South Sudan has been doing for some time, which both Sudan and South Sudan have been involved in one another's peace processes. A lot of South Sudan's security systems are kind of synchronized with their counterparts in the north of Sudan, and they'll be very worried about the potential of conflict, kind of sparks flying across the border. At the moment, there is some kind of buffer zones that exist along the border, but they'd be particularly worried about conflict spreading, or potentially oil supplies being cut off from the pipelines from South Sudan to Port Sudan, and the economic shock that might follow from that. I think most of the kind of more sort of extreme scenarios that have been discussed relate to possible geopolitical competition between Egypt and Ethiopia, potentially turning Sudan into a kind of proxy war. There is no evidence of Ethiopian involvement as of yet. That they do seem to be staying neutral for now. But Ethiopia has become politically very factionalized that might make it difficult for there to be a kind of uniform position. And if it does get drawn in or involve itself in the conflict in Sudan, this could be reciprocated, this dynamic, as in Sudanese belligerents could also become involved in the Ethiopia conflict. I think the last thing to say is that Egypt has been a kind of stalwart defender of the Sudan armed forces who are very much in the kind of Egyptian orbit. And there are reports of Egyptian involvement, particularly in providing air cover for the Sudan armed forces. The Sudan armed forces are likely to become more dependent on Egypt as time goes by, particularly as they run low on supplies, and also because the loss of military production sites in Khartoum North have been damaged in the fighting, and that will push Sudan armed forces even closer to Egypt.
Thank you very much, Dan. Anette, what are, in your opinion, some of the scenarios for the way forward, either as further risks of escalation, just to build on what Dan said, or options for conflict resolution? How do you see the next few months traveling?
Yeah, the next few months are likely to not see the generals give in and lay down arms unless they incur really dramatic military losses, I think. Or there is a concerted effort by the international community to put more pressure on them. And that could be along the lines of economic military support that Dan just referred to for the case of the Sudanese armed forces, which I think can only happen in combination with a similar pressure on the regional sponsor of the paramilitary rapid support forces, which is the United Arab Emirates. And I think here, Saudi Arabia could play or should play an important role, maybe also the Arab League, in making sure that that pressure comes from both sides. And this is also, I think, the only real influence that Western countries have at this stage, who lack access to the generals and leverage on them. So I think it is absolutely needed to combine the ongoing negotiations with, clear punitive measures in case of non-compliance with the humanitarian principles or non-compliance with the agreements, the ceasefire agreements. I think there's been great reluctance to, implement targeted sanctions. I'm not talking about countrywide sanctions, I'm talking about targeted sanctions on particular companies and individuals that play a crucial role in financing the business empires of the two generals. And since, as Dan just said, the domestic resource mobilization will run into problems, I think, in the very soon future. So you were asking about the coming next months. I think definitely this is what we are going to see. Then their reliance on their regional sponsors, so Egypt and the Emiratis, will increase. So therefore, pressuring them to stop their military and financial support is, I think, the only way forward. And it should go, I'm not saying that it's only pressuring and stopping negotiations, it's in combination, right, of these two political tools, that I think the only way forward to end the war and then also move from negotiations about humanitarian corridors and the required temporary ceasefire to something that leads towards more lasting peace. So I think I would stick to that rather than outlining the many scenarios that are there. I think the only use of those pretty bad scenarios are to urge the international community to take that action and increase the pressure on the generals, because it is a unique situation that I think no one of the neighboring countries or within the broader international community has an interest in seeing Sudan descend into a full-blown civil war with a regional dimension and hence destabilize parts of the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. I think here everyone is on the same page. That does not mean that everyone is interested in a democratic future for Sudan, but I think in the short term, there is a possibility of creating more leverage and pressure on the 2 points I've just outlined.
Thank you very much, Annette. So a combination of carrot and sticks in a way, and combining the negotiations with these like high instruments of pressure. I'll invite, before turning to Jok, I'll invite our audience to put in some questions. There are already a few, but we will turn into your questions soon. Jok, what is your take? What are the sort of recommendations of how to avoid a potential further spillover, or more than spillover, escalation of the conflict within Sudan, and how to avoid a further disintegration of the state?
Well, I think the 2 parties have already shifted their language away from the rhetoric of violence and attempt to humiliate and to insult. Daglo Hameti was talking about capturing Al-Burhan and killing him like a dog. Al-Burhan was talking about Hameti being a thug and a criminal, and even a criminal from West Africa. And that language went hand in hand with the intensity of violence, right? But now this language has shifted to one of, realizing that this is going to be a very difficult war to win in the battlefield. They are shifting to more language that is trying to appeal to the souls of the nation, to Sudanese people. No, none of them want to be seen by Sudanese as the more destroyer of the country. No, none of them want to be seen as the one who's starving the Sudanese people. So they are beginning to change that language, and that is already a sign of hope that they will now be going towards negotiating more. So staying the course of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and U.S. Mediation is one that need to be pursued more vigorously, because these parties are going to be convinced by the circumstances that nothing is going to happen. None of them is going to win unless you sit down and talk about it. There is now a chattel diplomacy between the 2 parties and Juba. So the AU and the IGAD countries are looking at the potential for a negotiation mediated by someone other than the Gulf countries. With the appointment of Malik Agar, Al-Burhan wanted to appeal to Juba to at least shun Daglo, not take him in, because they both have sent envoys to Juba to try to draw South Sudan on one side. So I think pursuing that, in view of the changing language, pursuing that diplomacy and that negotiation that is going on, to at least have the ceasefire. It is a very good agreement in terms of what it wants to achieve in the short term, which is primarily to focus on protecting life, protecting rights, preventing catastrophic famine, and trying to restore a sense of institutional functioning in the country. I think that is that language is good, and I think it should be pursued further.
Thank you very much. In a way, in all your remarks, you've really put the role of the military at the center and at the heart of the conflict that is ongoing, both obviously as a current event, but also as a historical legacy and as a structural driver. I struggle really to see how the conflict resolution going forward can really be done with the current actors and with the military so present and so central, which is something that Anette you alluded to. We have a couple of questions. I also want to leave you like a space to react to what one another said, and if you have further thoughts. But I'll put here two questions from our audience. The first one is, what are the key ingredients that are needed to bring about a sustainable, peaceful outcome to the conflict? Are the right interlocutors nations involved currently who could facilitate the path towards peace? And on that, I would also add, is the current geopolitical situation globally and with the Russia war in Ukraine being a further sort of constraint or challenge to conflict resolution in Sudan, or there is not really an impact on that? Then why don't I go first to you, and then Anette and Jok, and then we can close.
Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of, it's not just the right kind of interlocutors, which is the issue. I think that with a lot of these kind of, we've seen in Sudan, as Anette was talking about, the kind of proliferation of different forums of like the Quads, the UN, AU, IGAD mechanisms as well. And I think that having these proliferating forums does not necessarily make it easy to resolve this. In terms of who potential interlocutors might be, I think that this is a bit of a double-edged sword about involving some regional players, because on the one hand, you do want to have regional players sort of come together, try and put a stop to the conflict and prevent it from spilling across boundaries, but also some of these regional powers, as well as secondary players such as South Sudan and Chad, are also very militarized systems, militarized regimes themselves, and not necessarily going to push for the types of reforms that they might not want to see in their own countries, or might view as destabilizing Sudan further. So that's a really tricky one. I'm not quite sure how to kind of reconcile that. What I would generally push for is to try to find parties that can chart out a route to a more demilitarized and sustainable political foundation for Sudan. I think that's one of the key ingredients. And just on your point about kind of Russia, Ukraine, whilst I don't think that's directly related to the conflict as such, I think the effect that this has had on food prices has compounded the economic crisis in Sudan, and it's also going to make, which the war has in turn compounded further as well. So that would be, I think, one of the main implications of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Anette. Over to you. And there is also a question if anyone wants to take on the displacement situation and the risk for the neighboring countries who are obviously already strained in terms of like displaced people and humanitarian situation.
Yes, thank you. Great questions. I'd like to add to the first question about, success factors or ingredients and who should be involved. I mean, I fully agree that the most important thing is really to have a concerted effort this time around and to learn from the recent past and not have, multiple negotiations ongoing. I don't think that is proving helpful. That just increases the bargaining and trying to, score points here or there, and it totally distracts from what the focus should actually be. So I think that is the main success factor I would see. And then, of course, I have to reiterate that the civilians need to be part of those negotiations, and they've, repeatedly asked now and during the political dialogue we've seen leading up to this crisis. to at least make those negotiations more transparent. There might be, backdoor conversations that can't be made public. But I think the communication strategy has not learned these lessons yet. And when we talk about access to humanitarian aid, then of course I think people dealing with humanitarian aid should be involved, such as Martin Griffith, for instance, who was denied, participating in these talks for quite some time. So I think these are two crucial additions, I would see. And linking this to the question of the 1 million persons that we see displaced, some of them, those who could afford it, I guess, were able to cross into neighboring countries, but there's massive displacement inside Sudan. And again, those that cater for those internally displaced persons are civilians that themselves are struggling with skyrocketing prices, supplies running low, infrastructure being hugely affected. So the situation in places like Medani or Gadaref, where people are hosted in schools, are sleeping in people's home, that is already, I think, stretching the hospitality, and the Sudanese hospitality is, I think, one of the best in the world, if I may say so, but this will come to a certain limit. And therefore, whatever is being discussed in terms of humanitarian aid, I think it's important to really localize that approach, decentralize aid to also decrease the massive risk of political manipulation if all the aid comes through Port Sudan, which is controlled by the Sudanese armed forces. So entering humanitarian aid through Ethiopia, through Chad, Central African Republic, and of course Egypt, where already the border situation is a humanitarian disaster in itself, but where there would be possibilities then to channel that aid through those pockets and sometimes larger parts of the country that are currently stable, and where you can, and that is starting to take shape now, but at a very small scale, where some international NGOs do support the humanitarian actors on the ground, the resistance committees, volunteers, etc., that are delivering aid. So I think it's important to use those structures and also use the assessment, the needs assessment that have already been and are continuously updated by those civilian structures, instead of rolling out a 3-month UN needs assessment. I think that would just take a lot of time and not deliver better results than what is already there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to reiterate, the point that you made about how multiple negotiations are ultimately only advantageous to the armed actors, that they can score quick wins, whereas it is a unified and inclusive process, the one that should be looked at. And your point about the localization of aid, this is a wider discussion globally about humanitarian aid, and the one relevant example to implement that. We're almost out of time, and I want to leave the last word of wisdom for Jok.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think nobody can make these generals prioritize peace except themselves. In terms of neighboring countries being affected or being interested in intervening, obviously Egypt is the biggest player there with regards to the side of Al-Burhan, but Egypt is already inundated by refugees. About 50 to 70,000 have already gone there. Egypt does not have a lot of resources. Egypt might be able to, if it decide to support Al-Burhan side, it might be able to deliver some weapons, but nothing more. Ethiopia is not going to even lift a hand at the moment, because in fact, I think Ethiopia may be somewhat relaxing a little bit, because it simply, this war draws lights away from its own confrontation with Egypt over the waters of the Nile. South Sudan is already affected immensely by returning refugees. People who had fled South Sudan and went to Sudan are now going back. About 70,000 people are now on the borders. trying to get to various locations. So in terms of humanitarian challenges, already you had a country of 46 million people with 4 million people already needing food aid and being very food insecure, as the UN has indicated. And now you, on top of this, the challenges are immense, and there is a fatigue in terms of collection of donations from various countries. They made an appeal for $1 billion, the various aid agencies, for $1 billion to cover the next few months. And they only got $200 million. So where is it going to come from? So what is going to help is the pressure from within, from those neighborhood committees, from the activists who were through al-Bashir. They need to continue to be heard on this, except that, of course, they have been cowed by this terrible fighting. But pressure from within, pressure from outside is what is going to to bring to bear on the generals. But until they accept themselves to talk, nobody can make them.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank all of you, Anette Hoffmann, Dan Watson, and Jok Madut Jok. Has been a pleasure. I learned a lot. Thank you for our audience, for joining. There will be a recording of this webinar within a day, and stay tuned for our next episode of Conflict Briefings. Thank you very much to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.